My name is Lola Estelle, and this is Zorian Sasic. Our presentation today is mostly on ERM, from knowledge bases to KBART, ERM data migration into FOLIO. So we're going to take turns presenting today. We'll introduce ourselves first, and then I'll do kind of the first half and switch off to Zorian after that. We'll leave a bit of time at the end for some questions. Okay, you've got the clicker, great. I didn't know I'd be on a screen this big. I don't think I've ever seen, this is a very Taylor Swift moment for me to have my face up there like this, but I am an implementation consultant at EBSCO, working on FOLIO. Before coming to EBSCO, I spent about 10 years at what was called Serial Solutions business unit of ProQuest, back when that was a brand name, supporting and implementing e-resource access and management tools. From there, I went to a scholarly publisher. So some of my perspective today on this does come from a publishing perspective, which I've been happy to carry over into FOLIO as well, managing metadata and knowledge-based provider operations there. And most interestingly to me, I've been in a number of volunteer roles for NISO, helping to define and implement standards around electronic resources and other kinds of recommended practices for the scholarly communication community. So I will let Zorian introduce himself.
My mic's on, right? I didn't get a chance to test it before we started. Hi, everyone. I'm Zorian. I'm also a FOLIO implementation consultant at EBSCO. And before I started EBSCO, which was last year, I spent 8 years as an e-resource librarian in academic libraries, mostly in my state of Minnesota here in the US. I spent a lot of time in a bunch of different systems, working with Serial Solutions, 360 Core, 360 stuff, Alma Community Zone, OCLC, WMS, World Share Management, the collection manager part of it, now FOLIO, and EBSCO's holding management. Before I worked here, I was heavily involved in a consortium migrating to Alma, so I did a lot of e-resource management stuff for that. I was active in the content working group in Exlibris's Igloo organization. If you're not familiar with that, that particular group does a lot of the advising Exlibris on how to manage content in the various knowledge bases that they have. So I've been doing ERM for a while. And I also teach a kind of continuing education class on a platform called Library Juice for the introduction to ERM. So try to bring that expertise to our work here in FOLIO.
Thank you. Okay, so e-resource management, as you all know, is a complicated process. There's no standard approach to how e-resources are managed in any type of university or library. The complexity and the lack of uniformity really compounds the challenges surrounding ERM, whatever system you may be in, and around adopting standards and recommended practices for ERM as a whole. However, the general life cycle is pictured here. This is an older image from 2009 by Oliver Pesch, but it shows you all of the variety of things that do go into managing e-resources, and it's quite a lot. A few things since 2009 would be added here around transformative agreements and open access and other newer types of development. But this is still a really good basic reference for when we talk about ERM. What is it? It encompasses all of the things that you see here. So I want to talk very quickly, just to look at ERM systems, kind of the state of the technology, and then talk about standards that are applicable to ERM in general, and especially toward any library that's going to be migrating from one system to another or implementing FOLIO. So over the past couple of decades, as especially academic collection budgets went over almost a complete shift from print to electronic, librarians found that the tools they had to manage those things were very difficult and rudimentary. Started out with things we still see in some libraries today, spreadsheets and filing cabinets and kind of ad hoc homegrown approaches to electronic resource management. But in the early 2000s, knowledge bases, centralized authoritative collections of e-resource metadata basically emerged to power discovery systems. Well, at that time, what we called open URL link resolvers and A to Z lists, as the concept of discovery system didn't really quite exist yet. But the problem with that generation of technology was that it still siloed electronic resource management in one system and everything print in another. And librarians certainly found that the traditional ILS was not able to handle any of this at all. So that first generation of ERM tools bundled in the back offices of basically link resolvers and so forth, later morphed into now what we call the library services platform, such as FOLIO. So these are solutions that marry those two types of formats in one platform to manage. Additionally, sometimes a third format of digital objects such as data sets and images and so forth. So while it's come a long way and while LSPs are hugely popular now, they're by no means universal. We still see a lot of libraries that have that old spreadsheets and filing cabinets model, which is how we get to go, evolve, don't worry about us. But things still are evolving. We are not seeing anything right now replace the library services platform in terms of e-resource management, but we are seeing auxiliary tools come on the scene to supplement this. There are some efforts. CC Plus was a grant-funded effort led by Palsy, who discovered that in their current state, LSPs really didn't offer them the management tools to look at usage stats and make those kinds of e-resource decisions at a consortial level. So they have what is now the open source platform CC Plus in order to supplement an LSP that the consortia may be using. Additionally, the vendor consortium manager was founded by former staff of the consortium Danish Digital Library. They went through the reorg there and found that the information they needed to get to negotiate agreements with publishers was either difficult or impossible to get in any kind of structured format. So they say they saw an opportunity to create a newly developed service called Consortia Manager to get to those types of ERM tools. More recently, as interest in open access and all types of transformative agreements has exploded, that same vendor has created tools for decision support around transformative agreements, which, like Baskin-Robbins ice cream, transformative agreements come in many, many flavors. But we're basically looking at taking the traditional subscription and licensing spend from a publisher and reinvesting that money from the library to models where funding the article processing charges for their researchers who choose to publish open access. This is a very different role for the library as they've come to rely on these more traditional agreements. And now they have all these new data points to track who are our researchers. You know, when they submit to various publishers, is that publisher going to know we have a transformative agreement with them? And of course, this alludes to the development of Folio's open access app, which is helping libraries manage requests from their researchers to publish open access materials. We're looking at Folio's open access app, and I see Owen is here, integrating with the Invoice app to record payments and include all kinds of functionality to help manage those requests through the locally defined workflows. So we're seeing that there's really no one true approach to electronic resource management, right? And what that leads us to is kind of the next, oops, here's my clicker. What's coming next? So there was a very influential white paper published in 2020 by OhioLink, where they were looking at what the library platform of the future really needed to be. They had 4 basic recommendations. First of all, that these services need to be re-architected to center on the user, and that rather than looking at one model of a collection, it needs to be a facilitated collection that is going to be able to respond to all different types of acquisition models, including transformative agreements. It needed to not be siloed in the library anymore. Libraries are really looking to be more of a part of their institution and their research efforts, and moreover, a larger part of higher education. So these systems can't be siloed in the library anymore. And finally, they need better business intelligence than they had found in any of these e-resource services to date. Now, what's really interesting about this is just last week, I did see a press release that OhioLink has signed with Ex Libris and Alma to be their next library services platform. I have no comment on that, but I'll be very interested to see how Alma responds to this vision that OhioLink had put forward. So a little bit more about that central knowledge base that I mentioned earlier. This concept is key to many aspects of e-resource management and therefore most ERM systems. The knowledge base is that repository of metadata describing the whole universe of electronic content that is available. And where does that data in the knowledge base come from? It comes from various sources, but by and large, the metadata in a knowledge base, that title level and package level metadata, comes from KBART files. KBART is a standard or recommended practice developed by NISO. It's been around for a couple of decades, so it's certainly not new, but it's got a longevity. It's very simple in what it seeks to transmit to you. And I'm going to make no mistake about this. KBART is my favorite NISO standard. I know we all have one. KBART is mine. There's a close second, the Open URL standard, but it's got such a cold, calculating little brain that it just doesn't give you the forgiveness that KBART does. But basically, if we want to see this, here you go. I know this is a thing of beauty. It is a KBART file. Basically, all this is telling you is this is the metadata about this distinct content package that a publisher sells. Here are the titles within it. Here's the title history. Here are the ISSNs, coverage range, and so forth. So a publisher or a content provider of some type will share this with knowledge bases such as GoKB in many cases, although it may be libraries curating that data themselves, or the EBSCO knowledge base, or any of those other commercial knowledge bases that are out there. So to centralize this central knowledge base when a library is implementing FOLIO or any kind of system, they're going to go into the knowledge base informed by KBART, and they're going to customize it to what they need. They probably don't get this big generic package as you see here, although they might. They may get selected titles only, or they may have different coverage dates for this particular package and so forth. So they go in and they do the work of customizing what is in the knowledge base. Now, when I talk to librarians about a challenge in implementing a new system or migrating to a new system, one surprising topic that comes up again and again is really being able to identify in that central knowledge base the packages that they subscribe to. There's a lack of uniformity here. What a package is called on their invoice, on their license, on a KBART file, and in a knowledge base may all be slightly different. And a completely hypothetical example of that, this is, say you're a librarian and you have just licensed nature. You go into your knowledge base, such as one pictured here, and you're thinking, I'm going to activate nature. What a simple task for me today. But then you see dozens of packages that may or may not be the nature package that you subscribe to. One of these may fit your needs. Perhaps you need to select a couple and then customize the data within them. What seems like such a simple task is really one of the real bugaboos of migrating from one system to another. And again, this is nothing unique to nature or this particular knowledge base. This is a very common occurrence that we see. So one standard that's emerging to try to address this problem from NISO is that of package identifiers, trying to get all knowledge base providers on board and all publishers on board to say, if you are selling this package to a library, how can they consistently identify that across knowledge bases and other related tools? It's not easy to do this. The way that content is sold and packaged from region to region or by consortium can vary greatly. So it's not a simple task. This workforce, this working team is in process right now to try to develop what this identifier might be. I think they're doing a pretty good job of keeping up with their progress to see where this goes, because it won't be an easy thing to get everyone on board, certainly, but it will disambiguate a lot of things and make migration and implementation much easier for libraries undertaking that task. A related effort is the Open Discovery Initiative, also sponsored by NISO. Now, yes, this is about discovery, but the concept is very much the same. That knowledge base that's underlying the discovery tools is also underlying the ERM tools, and being able to look for clarification as to what exact content should I activate in my knowledge base is something that librarians need help with. This recommended practice says that both the content provider or publisher, as well as the knowledge base provider, should be able to provide guidance to libraries in this respect. It's not always easy to do that, but the responsibility doesn't simply lie on the librarian side. It would be a very difficult task to figure all of this out when migrating from system to system. So a lot of publishers out there, and I think publishers do a lot of wonderful things, but often metadata is not at the top of their mind. Our big publishers, our Elsevier, our Springer and Wiley, they've got the resources and the technology to really transmit great metadata out into the world, not just through KBART files, but in all kinds of ways. But smaller publishers, society publishers, university presses, and so forth, they don't always have the resources to be able to really up their metadata game and get all of this very transparent and done very well. So I usually do encourage libraries who are working with publishers like this to get across to them the importance of being able to get good KBART files, to be able to work with knowledge-based providers to help the libraries activate the right resources. Publishers in many ways, as long as they get the identifiers assigned that are essential to their business, the ISSNs, the ISBNs, the DOIs, and so forth, that is a checkbox they're going to check. And the other big thing I discovered is that as long as they are indexed correctly in Google Scholar and Web of Science, in many ways at that point, they feel that their job is done. Library discovery systems represent a very small amount of traffic to content providers. That's a totally separate subject that I would love to talk about. But this is why getting this metadata right is often not top of mind for publishers at all. And it really does fall upon the libraries to get this right on their side. So I want to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about, and then I'll hand it over to Zorian to talk about Folio in particular. Now, I worked at SPIE, so I know their content very well. The way that the content is licensed and sold to libraries, we have the SPIE Digital Library, which is the books and the proceedings, and then you've got the ebooks as an add-on. So my new customer has licensed SPIE Digital Library. They're very excited. They go to their knowledge base. Which one of these is right? Why is it like this? As a small publisher, I'm not necessarily going to have the resources to know. I'm not necessarily going to have access to this knowledge base in order to look into those title lists and tell you which is the right one. Why is it like this? Partially, I'll just admit, being in charge of metadata operations at SPIE, it made no sense for us to send out our KBART files in this way. I won't bore you why, but to go back and retroactively fix that would have been challenging. The other thing is content migration. You see some of the provider listed here, American Institute of Physics. SPIE used to be on that platform and then migrated to their own. Librarians didn't always go into their knowledge base and make that change. So those older AIP packages that you see here were no longer correct. Usage for any library that had that activated, ERM artifacts for any library that had those activated, those were wrong. So that's one reason. Another reason of what you see here are consortial packages. You see here there are packages listed for BibSam, Justice, and so forth. While the publisher should be in charge of delivering high quality KBART files to the knowledge base provider, that doesn't always happen. And for consortia, they're not always accurate. So many consortia take it upon themselves to add this to the knowledge base. The problem with that is they don't always keep it up. So at one point in time, these consortial packages were correct, but over time, the title lists become outdated, the URLs no longer work, and a library has selected a package here that's going to fail for them all around, and it's going to be a support ticket, and we'll have to get to the root of why. So say you're migrating from this knowledge base to the other hypothetical one here, WorldCat knowledge base. What you see here is totally different. If I were the librarian migrating from one to another, and by the way, the correct ones are in red here, I would say this looks, SPIE content looks nothing in this knowledge base like it did in my previous one. Here we see a couple consortial packages from Bacon, a consortium in France, but also another old platform. Silverchair hosted the SPIE Digital Library many, many years ago. It was never deactivated in the WorldCat knowledge base. So again, those long-term customers were perhaps on something that had the completely wrong information in it. Say you're on this knowledge base and you want to go to GoKB. Now, this is beautiful. We look at simplicity. GoKB is very often, it doesn't have all of that old legacy problematic stuff in it. It's often curated directly by librarians. So it's a little bit more up to date, or by the provider if the provider wants to participate in this. So this looks really good. A library going to GoKB is going to have a lot less confusion when they hit this point. And finally, in the EBSCO knowledge base underlying Folio for those EBSCO hosted libraries, we see a lot more variation here. Now, during migration, in many cases, the librarian is going to struggle with this on their own. In other cases, their service provider is going to have a conversion team to help them map what were your e-holdings in the old knowledge base, what are they in the new knowledge base. But it's not always clear. There's still going to be some back and forth. There is still going to be questions for the librarians to answer and send them kind of scurrying to their licenses and invoices to try to find out what exactly do I have access to. What should be a simple question, what have I licensed, is just not always the case. So that's a little bit of background on the standards and how they can help us out here, why this matters to libraries migrating. But to take a deeper dive into Folio, I'm going to hand it over to Zorian now.
Thank you, Lola, for that lovely theoretical high-level summary of e-resources and the content systems that we use to try to manage them or not manage them. I'm going to forward the slide. So speaking specifically about Folio ERM, which I have defined here as organizations, licenses, and agreements, depending on what you use for a knowledge base. It can be also e-holdings, a local knowledge base, GoKB, etc. But I'm really going to be talking about the kind of management apps in this presentation. Possible sources of data for this, as Lola kind of exhaustively mentioned: KBART files, KB exports, and by KB exports I mean knowledge base exports of various. It can be a CSV file. It can be in Zero Solutions. It's called the database details report, which is at the package level. It can be a title level thing, although title level lists are very long and are maybe not what you want to do agreements on. Depends on how you want to structure your ERM. Alma Community Zone is another package list from Alma. Coral, holdings management from EBSCO. You can do other things like A to Z databases list, internal spreadsheets. You know, I know a lot of libraries that I've worked with and ones I've worked in have, you know, an internal spreadsheet, even though they're doing acquisitions in the ILS, that shows all their, you know, EBSCO databases or ProQuest databases, their Elsevier package, and exactly how much it's a spreadsheet tracking the acquisition side of things and what the invoice number is in the ILS and stuff. You can use those as sources. Subscription agents, once again, this is at the title level, you know, that's going to harass. So there's probably others that I don't know about. Those only two I've worked with directly. There's lots of sources for ERM data, and we're not even talking really about licenses. Licenses is on here, but it's a whole nother, I think license records are like a separate thing, depending on how you define licenses versus agreements. But we have all these sources, and unlike a lot of other areas of Folio, there's not a lot of obvious options for migrating them into Folio. There's no in-app bulk import or export options to interface. A lot of these other knowledge bases that we've talked about do have those. Zero Solutions has them, Alma has them. I'm not sure if WMS has them, but they're usually, you know, UI-based things. The ERM apps are not currently utilized or targetable by data import or export apps in Folio. Those are primarily driven by inventory. And then there's no bulk edit for ERM apps either. So not just migrating data, which is, you know, an implementation migration question, but bulk editing coverage for period start dates and end dates and agreements. Bulk changing organizations. If you join a consortium and you need to put, and you're on a single tenant and you're sharing organizations or you're splitting them out, you may need to add prefixes to their names. There's no way to like do that in the interface easily. So what do we do? I know that a lot of libraries end up just manually inputting their data over time, and there's not really like a data migration for their ERM stuff. It's just mapping it and putting it in, just putting in the man hours to do it. But like a lot of things in Folio, at least I've learned in the last year of being part of the project, there is usually some form of API solution. And what my team has done at EBSCO, and I'm not going to take the credit for creating any of this. That's my colleague, Kyle Banerjee, who has produced a lot of stuff that you can find on the GitHub. There's a GitHub link later in this presentation. We have a bunch of open tools for data migration. We've created human readable templates. They're just Excel sheets, which you can see here with very human readable columns that correspond to fields. In this case, this example is an agreement template. So we have the agreement name, the status, the alternative name, description, org code 2 that I've actually added that on since I got this template. If you have multiple organizations, that can represent like if you get something through a consortia and you pay the consortia for it, but the content provider is actually a different organization, you can have 2 organizations attached to one agreement. Start date, end date, and you can see if you know the interface, like the colored fields, the colored columns are the fields that correspond to the required fields to make a record. And at the very least, this template can serve as if a customer wanted to enter stuff, a library wanted to enter stuff in manually, they could do it this way. But I think you can also use these data sources we just talked about and map them to this sheet as well, which I'm going to get into. But we take this sheet, obviously we can't just put the Excel sheet into Folio. It's not that easy yet. We take this sheet and transform it into a tab delimited file. And that file is mapped directly to the endpoint, the API endpoints, and then you can use whatever your preferred way of API interaction with Folio to get them in. People use Jupyter notebooks, usually with Python scripts. They can use VS Code to do the same thing. Postman also usually the same thing. We personally use the shell scripts I alluded to, and there's a link to that. And I think this slide is attached to the sched for this talk. So if you want to look at that, you can reach the link there. There's specific scripts in there for organizations, agreements, and licenses. I'm not going to go into all the script. You'll go there and see that there's a lot more than just creating these records. There's updating them. There's putting in specific fields. I actually shouldn't do that presentation from my colleague Kyle should, but there's a lot of, these are very bolt-on processes and allows you to like target specific fields to add stuff on. So they're very simple, but they're very powerful. So kind of I'm going to walk through organizations and agreements and kind of more specifically how this happens. So for organizations I'm going to use the knowledge base list example. So this could be, the reports I mentioned from the various systems. I'm most familiar now with the holdings management report from the EBSCO's knowledge base. You have a list of e-resources by collection or package. Usually that list has a vendor or provider column, right? It has a bunch of data, depending how big your library is, it may have dozens, it may have hundreds of databases, and each one has a column that says EBSCO, ProQuest, SPIE, whatever. You focus on that column and use that column as the basis for organization name. You can indicate the type of organization. So I know this would correspond to organization type in Folio. So is it a consortia? Is it a content provider? Is it a administrative interface? Is it a library software provider? Like if you're tracking like your discovery tool subscriptions and stuff, that's a library software tool. You could label it that. You also need to come up with an org code. This is just stuff you would be doing in the interface anyways. We've kind of started playing around with coming up with standardized org codes for at least for EBSCO's knowledge base. We haven't really done too much work on that yet, but so and I'm sorry if it looks pretty big. So kind of looking at this is these are 3 screenshots. The first one is a HLM package report from EBSCO. And you can see I've highlighted the vendor name column, and you can see that this is alphabetized by vendor. So you have some duplicates in terms of the first 3 packages on this are from Alexander Street, the next 4 from Bloomsbury, Credo, etc. And what I usually do is I take this list or any knowledge base list in that column, and I create a pivot table to dedupe it. So that takes that column, which is much, 500 rows long, and turns into a list of, a much smaller list, maybe 100 organizations. And those are the organization names that then go into the spreadsheet, as you can see there. And then along the way, I create an org code. So Alexander Street becomes ASP. That's a pretty common acronym, at least in English, for Alexander Street Press, Bloomsbury, Bloom, et cetera, et cetera. And then we kind of fill in some of the other categories. The vendor, do you want it to be a vendor, yes or no? No, that's probably a whole nother conversation about the vendor switch in organizations for acquisitions purposes or not. And then org status. So we generally, when I do this for our clients, I typically just leave everything active because this is for migration, and not a lot of our clients want to migrate inactive stuff. But if you did, you could easily, and that affects that field in Folio. So then this is kind of a continuation. So that the upper left corner box, that's the same template I just showed. I'm just using it for continuation here. So that template then becomes transformed into this. This is the notepad version of the tab delimited file. But you can see that those headers from the template, the XLSX text template, become closer to what the endpoints are called in Folio. No, they're not exactly what the API endpoints are, because this is being processed by a shell script that may or may not rename them for the purposes of processing text and stuff. And at the end of this presentation, I'll show the actual scripts. But those roughly correspond to like the endpoints in the API code. And I know there's other people in the audience that know that API code much better than I. But so then that text file is loaded via the shell script, which just calls it. The shell script includes like tenant information and login stuff. And then the end result is what you see on the right, which is a list of organizations in Folio. And then we're going to walk through a little bit similar. It's pretty similar with agreements. I probably don't have to take as much time. Agreements are a little bit, I think actually agreements are simpler than organizations. That kind of going back to organizations, I know there's a whole bunch more information you can put in organizations. Some of the other shell scripts that are included on the GitHub handle that, like contacts, interfaces, stuff like that. You can't, with the scripts are not designed to do like all that at once. It's kind of iterative because you may not have interfaces for every organization and stuff like that. So there's more to this than just these basic kind of core organization record fields. Organizations has a lot more. If we showed the full template, I'm not showing the full template, but if you look, the templates are also available on the GitHub if you want to look at them. This template actually has like 6 or 7 tabs in addition to the main one, and those tabs account for interfaces, contacts, addresses, emails, all the stuff that you can put into organization record. But getting back forward to agreements. Agreements are a little bit simpler, or they can be in theory, depending on how much you prefer to use supplementary properties. So for agreements, we can use the same source data. We can use the same KB list. It's actually more direct for this because the KB list is a list of databases. And this method kind of assumes, and it can be refined a little bit, that databases in a knowledge base, collections in a knowledge base, packages in a knowledge base are equivalent to agreements. Now, that is, as Lola kind of showed repeatedly, each knowledge base may not have exactly what the name of the knowledge base as the customer, the client, or the vendor calls it available, and they may have old versions. So this is kind of, if you're using a knowledge base list or a KBART list or some other list, you're going to be using the name that you as a library know. So you take that list, you use the package name column, you use the org codes from the first step. usually you put your organizations in, then you make agreements. You need to have a start date. So the start date, the library will know that, or they may not know that. Then you can just assume. I usually, if libraries don't know, I kind of say, well, just put in July 1 or January 1, which are common renewal dates. And if it's a renewable resource, when you get to that point, when you renew it, go in and change it. The last step, this is kind of something that's more theoretical in my mind than it is in practice. And it is, in my opinion, the holy grail for at least at EBSCO Folio implementation, is to be able to load agreements, hook up their e-holdings via the holdings IQ API, and then have the ability to automatically, if you're using HLM as your data source for agreements, automatically map the e-holdings packages as agreement lines to those things. And one way to do that is to use the EKBAD from HLM, put it into a field. You'll see later on, I put it in description. It's probably not the best field, but that's the one that shows up in the template. So that's another option, is like finding a mechanism to, because right now our clients have to, if they're going to make connections between agreements and e-holdings or whatever, they have to do it manually. And I think we can do better than that. So here's another. So the arrows make it look more complicated because they're crossing, but you see the same holdings management report up top. But like I said, this is really can be vendor agnostic because most package lists from most systems have the same kind of data. So you take the vendor name, as you see, that becomes the org code. That's kind of, there's an intermediary step I'm not showing there, but you're repopulating the org code that you already figured out. You're putting the package name in the agreement name list. Now you could see here that there's a bunch of, based off the org code, this whole list of EBSCO databases. Depending on your situation, depending on if you get all of your stuff from a vendor, from one particular vendor, from one vendor on the same license, versus you may order some stuff direct and some through a consortium, they might be on different time periods or different license terms even. You could collapse everything into one agreement later on. You could call it just EBSCO databases, and that would be one agreement. And eventually down the line, you would hook all the agreement lines for all these EBSCO databases to it, and you'd have the one-to-many relationship. But for the sake of like simplicity, and a lot of clients I've worked with so far have preferred this method, just they can go and do that later. We just load all the databases, and then if they want to collapse it, they can do that on their own. You can see the description field, those are EKB IDs that I mentioned that could be theoretically used to do a match. And then the start date field, and you can see, oh wow, you can see that I did a fill on that because instead of doing the same one a bunch of times, I did them all in a row. So this particular library that I'm showing has something due every day in the month of January. That's probably not normal. I did not catch that to just now, so that's fun. So of course, other things like status, alternative name, start date, are assigned by the user. Those are typically not in a previous system that is not Folio's information. You still have to assign those. You can, like I said, you can fill something correctly, not with a descending number like I did, and easily populate that. It doesn't have to be a manual entry thing unless you have completely different subscription dates. And then the last bit was just what I said about the EKB IDs. Here we are, continued again. There's no confusing arrows on this slide, so hopefully that either helps or hinders the explanation. The top left one is the same, it's the populated template for agreements. You can see all the data. The bottom left is, it's not the full tab delimited file, but a small snippet of it that fits on here. You can see, once again, that the template headers have been transformed into headers in the tab delimited file that more correspond to API endpoints for agreements. We have name, alternate names, description, org, start date. And then on the right, you can see how that ends up into Folio the way it did. And you can see, yeah. So then, I don't know how well you can see this. It looks pretty small from my screen up here, but these are what the actual shell scripts for organizations and agreements look like. You can see at the top, these are blank on purpose, but like tenant okapi or okapi token, that's the login information for the API. If you use APIs in Folio, you know exactly what that is. You can see below that, it calls a specific file. I think that's in file equals vendors.tsv. That would be the TSV file, or the tab delimited file I keep showing. So that's where it calls the file with the actual data. And you can see I don't have, because our slides up there, not here. I don't have the mouse or the, is there a pointer? I wish I had a pointer. But if you look at line 37, no, not line 37, line 39 on the first script, IFS equals single quote caret read. It shows a bunch of, those are the actual endpoints in Folio. So if you want to add more information, as long as you have the endpoints and as long as all the headers and stuff line up, you can add different information into that. So that's kind of how you can control it. So this is a very like simple, I didn't write it. Full disclosure, it's Kyle Banerjee wrote this. But you can use this to call different things. It needs to match though. So our organizations, if you're not adding all those things, you don't necessarily need all of them. And they need to be in the same order as in the tab delimited file. But something similar you can see in the agreement shell script line 41. It's the same kind of thing. It's a lot shorter because, as I said, agreements nominally have generally less fields, at least in the beginning. But the same thing, name, description, alt name, start date, end date. And that's kind of how the scripts work. Now, of course, there's a few caveats that some of which I've already mentioned. One is obviously some data you have to generate at the row level, no matter what, like start date. Some of the sources, like title-based sources, are not a great fit necessarily for agreements, unless you decide to do, like for EBSCOnet, for instance, if you have a journal subscription agent and you have a bunch of single subscription journal titles, you might want those at the agreement level because you only have one or two. So you'll have an agreement for, let's say, Sage, and you'll have one Sage title. And I generally encourage people, like, don't call the agreement Sage, call their Sage journals, call it title that you're going to think of at renewal. Those lists can be used to supplement agreements and can be loaded this way too. I think the biggest caveat is like there's some complex objects, like I've mentioned, supplementary properties several times. Supplementary properties kind of get into pick lists, multi-type, all the kind of different ways users can define agreements or supplementary properties in the settings. Make this code have to be a bit more involved. We don't have actually code for supplementary properties. I think it's possible just because like it's API things, but that would be a lot more complicated to bulk in. But at the same time, if like certain examples of supplementary properties that people might use, I'm working with a library in the UK that wants to use supplementary properties to define all their databases based on SCONal categories, like SCONal reporting. And I was like, oh, we can use supplementary properties for that. And there's only like 3 supplementary properties and define them. And I loaded all their stuff this way, and I was just like, well, now they have 350 agreements, and I have to figure out how to code the supplementary properties with the multi-select pick list. So that gets into, you need to really know a bit more about APIs. So this is not an easy solution, but it's, I'm definitely not someone who's super familiar with APIs. I'm not Kyle Banerjee who wrote this, but I've found it easy as a project management person to use to help do basic ERM data migrations. And that's all I have. That's all we have. So I'm gonna check chat quickly. Doesn't look like we have any questions on chat. So yeah, if we want to open it up to questions to the floor, we can do that. Hello. Hi, Mike.
Oh,
Do you want me to bring this up? Do you want me to bring this up there, maybe?
No, it's shut.
Okay.
Have you guys found many of the libraries that migrated to Folio will export holdings in KBART format, getting ready to load? I found most libraries, they aspire to KBART. They like being able to say they may export, but they actually in practice don't leverage KBART much. What's been your experience with working with libraries moving to Folio?
That's a good question, Mike. So the question was, do libraries that we work with usually export their e-holdings? I'm going to not use the word e-holdings because that's confusing at a Folio convention. E-resources from their various systems in KBART format. And the answer is No, because I think Lola mentioned in her thing, there's not an actual package identifier standard that's included in KBART right now. They're working on it. But like a KBART list is a title list. And there's different kinds of KBART files, right? They're not all equal.
Right.
You could probably talk a lot more about that than I, but
Well, I think what libraries would really love to do in this case is get automated and customized KBART lists from their providers. This has been an effort that's been in process for a number of years, hoping libraries hoping that the provider can give them a KBART list that's not just the general generic descriptor for that package, but something that's pre-customized for them with their selected titles already there, with their custom coverage ranges already there, even customized URLs already. And again, the bigger publishers that have the resources in order to do that can supply that. And that makes it very easy for the library, if they are migrating between systems, to be able to do something like that, to upload their custom KBART list into the new knowledge base and automatically do all of that for them. As I mentioned, many smaller publishers and even medium-sized publishers aren't putting that at the top of their development list in order to be able to provide that. It's a surprisingly manual job, and this is why I say KBART is more art than science. Right now, for many libraries, if they ask a provider for that custom KBART list that they can upload into a knowledge base and have everything automatic for them, the provider ends up doing a bit of that by hand. The bibliographic metadata may be in one database at the provider's end, and the sales data in another database. So cobbling those together, the publisher doesn't have a good business case to do that, so they won't. So it's often your sales staff at these publishers or your support staff who are cobbling this together manually, which is prone to all kinds of user error and takes a long time. So I think that over time we may see that more, but yes, right now, to make migration an easier task, that's not always an option that's available to them.
yeah, like Lola said, if the KBART's almost there from the knowledge bases that we use, it's not quite there. So the proprietary reports that the various ones can use are usually better for the purposes of these various apps. You can use them for like I said, I'm using one HLM report for like 2 different apps. In a KBART file, if I could get a KBART file with all the vendors, it's either combining like 60, yeah, right. So typically if they provide anything that's either an internal spreadsheet or we offer that we can, with EBSCO, we can pull their HLM for them. But if they want to provide, like we have a few customers on Serial Solutions, and we've started saying like, hey, you're giving us a file for HLM conversion already for the knowledge base transfer. Like, let's just use that file for agreements now too.
This is kind of an auxiliary comment, but it surprised me so much when I was working at a knowledge base vendor previously to see that the metadata in the knowledge base was so often erroneous, flat out wrong, broken URLs, lots of problems there. And I used to think, why is it that this data we get directly from these providers is so riddled with errors? Don't they understand their own content? But it was only when I worked at a publisher that I realized that data is not always easily available even to them to pull from their databases. Things like title changes over time. If a publisher has switched platforms themselves many times, maybe their flagship journal has had 5 names, but that's not in their new knowledge base. They don't care what that title was called in 1925. It has nothing to do with their current business practice. So you go to create a KBART file and the librarian wants to know the title history. I went down to the basement and found the print issues in order to find out what did this journal used to be called. I mean, that's how sophisticated this operation was, and it's a good publisher. So anyway, that's just an aside, but it was once I started working in publishing that I realized why this metadata is often so poor and why I do encourage libraries to push back on publishers to provide better metadata so that they don't end up with these discovery and management problems. So thank you for that rant. Any other questions on chat?
Yeah, I have a comment on that. Just say
It's like there was more than 7 words. I'm not going to remember.
Thanks. Just to say, I'm doing a session tomorrow on the options for bringing knowledge-based data into folio agreements, and I will be hoping to generate some discussion about what people need, including talking about KBART for automation, the standard used for suppliers to provide those institutional specific files that you just mentioned. So yeah, please come along to that. But I also had a question about the process you were describing, Zorian, which is you talked about the use of the eHoldings ID in the description for the agreement. Is that right? And I wondered whether that, like, because you could use that to link up the resource as well to the agreement automatically. Is there a reason why you don't do that, or is there something I can do to help make, would that be useful? And if so, can I help?
Good question. So in this case, in theory, it really depends on if you use eHoldings, the eHoldings app or not, because that's the basis of the agreement lines in those cases. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could definitely help because you know more than me about this, about APIs and the apps. But in terms of like a field that would be better for matching than descriptions, I know description is probably like a free text field with X amount of characters or whatever on the back end. We would know from HLM what those IDs are, depending on how we pull it from HLM, a little bit more there. So it's mostly like a scripting thing on our end that we have to figure out, but like having a good preferred field to put it in, that would then, we can then use to call the API that creates an agreement line and attaches it. That would be helpful, right? So there's like the agreement line API, I guess. I'm speaking maybe nonsensically. Right, that would be helpful if there was a way to simplify my. Okay. Yeah, we should talk. We should talk. Does anyone else have any questions while I'm standing here? Trying to not fall. All right, if there's no other questions, like I said, this the slides for this are on the event thing on Sketch. If you want to access the slides themselves and some of the links in the slides, including the GitHub stuff, it's in there for you all to look at. I'm just gonna check chat one more time, and there's nothing else in chat. So,
Well, I do want to say thank you for the opportunity to stand on this grand stage and talk about my favorite ISO standard. It's been a zenith in my little bit of mortality here. So if anybody wants to talk about KBART more, please let me know.
yes, thanks
Thank you all.
everyone.